There is a strip of sand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, narrower than the runway of the airport you last flew out of. Less than 300 acres. A man could walk its length in about 20 minutes, from one lapping shoreline to the other. And somewhere beneath it, right now, under a road, under a fuel drum, under the concrete floor of a building where people go about an ordinary day, lie the bones of young men who were promised they would come home. In a way, they did come home. Their names did. Their photographs did. A folded flag, pressed into a mother's hands, did. But not them. For more than 70 years, the men buried on that island simply could not be found. Not because no one looked, because the island itself had swallowed them, and the country that sent them had, quietly, moved on. This is the story of how that happened. And it is the story of the men who refused to let it stand. The island is called Betio. It sits at the southwest tip of a ring of coral called Tarawa, in a part of the Pacific so remote that most of the men who died there had never heard its name until the week they were ordered to take it. Today it belongs to the Republic of Kiribati. In November of 1943 it was a Japanese fortress, and it was the objective of a battle that would last just 76 hours and would carve itself into American memory like few others before it. To understand why, you have to understand the men who were waiting. Most of them were very young. Some had lied about their age to enlist. On the rolls of the dead from Tarawa, there is a boy who was 16 years and 9 months old, a private first class from Birmingham, Alabama. There is a master gunnery sergeant who was 45, from Dover, New Hampshire, old enough to be that boy's father. Between those two numbers lived the whole of a generation, farm boys and factory workers and college students, men who had grown up in the Depression and had never expected the world to ask this much of them. The youngest of them had been children of 10 and 11 when the hard years hit, raised on scarcity and quiet endurance, taught not to complain. When the recruiting posters went up, they lined up. Some were turned away for being too young and came back with papers that said otherwise. It is easy at this distance to picture them as figures in grainy film, anonymous and interchangeable. They were not. They were as vivid to themselves and as certain of their own futures as you are of yours. They were Marines, most of them from the 2nd Marine Division. They had trained in New Zealand. They wrote letters home about the heat and the boredom and the things they missed. Among 1,000 young men there were, inevitably, those carrying a photograph of someone they meant to marry, and those with a child at home they had never met. That is not sentiment, it is arithmetic. Those letters are the ordinary furniture of ordinary lives, the kind of thing written by men who do not yet know they are writing near the end. And that is the hardest thing to hold in your mind about Tarawa. Every one of the 1,021 had a full and specific life behind him, a hometown, a way of laughing, and every one of those lives was about to be reduced, in the paperwork of a distant office, to a single line and a single word. And then, in the middle of November, they climbed down into landing craft in the dark and turned toward a shoreline they could not yet see. The plan depended on the tide. It always does, in an amphibious landing. The Marines needed enough water over the coral reef that ringed Betio for their boats to float across it and put men directly onto the beach. The charts and the tide tables promised there would be enough. There was not. What happened at Tarawa on the morning of the 20th of November is still remembered as the tide that failed. The water over the reef was too shallow. The landing boats scraped to a halt hundreds of yards from shore, caught on the coral like toys set down on a table, and the men inside had a choice that was not really a choice. They could stay in the boats, which the Japanese gunners had already ranged, or they could climb over the side into chest-deep water and wade, slowly, across those hundreds of yards, holding their rifles over their heads, while every weapon on the island turned toward them. The Japanese commander of Betio had reportedly boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take the island in 100 years. He had spent months preparing. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, guns sighted precisely on the water the Marines now had to cross on foot. Many never reached the beach at all. They fell in the lagoon, in water so shallow it barely covered them. The men behind them kept coming, because there was nowhere to go but forward, past friends who had been wading beside them a moment before. Some of those men were never seen again after that morning, not lost in any way a witness could later describe, simply gone into the water and the smoke, their names moving quietly from one list to another, from the living to the missing. For those who made it, the beach offered almost no cover, only a low sea wall of coconut logs, and behind it, a strip of sand a few yards wide that had to be held with bodies. By the end of that first day, the Marines controlled a piece of Betio you could measure in feet, less than a quarter-mile of ground, and it had already cost them more than anyone watching from the ships could bear to count. It took 3 more days. When it was over, on the 23rd of November, the island was declared secure. Of the roughly 5,000 Japanese and Korean defenders and laborers, almost none surrendered. And on the American side, in 76 hours, more than 1,000 Marines and sailors were dead or dying of their wounds. 1,021 men. On an island smaller than many city parks. The photographs that came back from Tarawa changed something in the country. For the first time, Americans saw images of their own dead lying on a foreign beach, floating at the water's edge, sprawled against that coconut sea wall. There was a public outcry. People demanded to know how a victory could cost so much. But that reckoning belonged to the living. The dead had a more immediate need. They had to be buried, quickly, in a climate that would not wait. And so they were. This is the part of the story that would echo for the next 70 years. In the days during and after the battle, the men who fell were buried where the fighting had left them. There was no time, and no ground, for anything else. Betio was a construction site under fire. Graves were dug wherever they could be dug, in the sand, in shell craters, in long shallow trenches. Men buried their friends between one assault and the next, marking the spots as best they could, with a rifle stuck bayonet down into the earth, a helmet set on top, a cross made from ammunition crates, a name written on whatever would hold ink. Picture doing that, digging a shallow trench in coral sand while the fighting is still close enough to hear, laying a man you trained beside into the ground, and having only a few seconds to record where he is before you are called forward again. The men who did this were not grave diggers. They were exhausted young survivors, and they did their best with pencil stubs and memory. It was never going to be enough to survive what came next. Some of the dead were gathered into rows and given proper cemeteries, with real crosses and, later, white fences. There were more than 30 of these burial plots scattered across an island you could cross on foot in minutes. Chaplains read services. Photographs were taken of neat lines of markers under the palms. To the families back home, those photographs were a kind of mercy. Your son is at rest. Your son has a grave. Your son can be found. But here the ground begins to shift beneath the story. Because Betio was not, in the end, a cemetery. It was an airfield. It had been taken for one reason, to give American bombers a runway thousands of miles closer to Japan. And almost as soon as the shooting stopped, the engineers arrived to build. Bulldozers reshaped the island. New roads went in. The airstrip was widened and paved. Fuel lines and buildings and revetments spread across ground that, only weeks before, had been a battlefield and a graveyard at the same time. And in the rush to build, the markers came down. This is the quiet catastrophe at the center of everything. The wooden crosses, the painted names, the careful maps of who lay where, were moved, or removed, or simply lost, while the men they marked stayed exactly where they were, underground. In some cemeteries the graves were beautified for the cameras, made to look orderly and permanent, when the records of who was actually in them had already grown confused. Later investigators would make a bitter discovery. Many of the neat marked graves were only memorials. The bodies were somewhere else, and the somewhere else was no longer written down. Think about what that means for a moment. A family receives a photograph of a white cross with their son's name on it. They frame it, they grieve beside it. And the cross is standing over empty ground, while the young man himself lies 50 yards away, beneath what is about to become a road. The war moved on. It had to. The Pacific was vast, and the fighting rolled westward, toward islands whose names would replace Tarawa in the headlines. Betio became a way station, then a backwater, then quiet again, and the men in the sand waited. In 1946, the country came back for them. A unit called the 604th Quartermaster Graves Registration Company arrived on Betio in the spring of that year. Their job was among the hardest and least spoken of in the entire war. They were the men who recovered the dead, who opened the field graves, who tried to give names back to remains that the tropics and time had not been kind to. They came with dental charts and record books, and a grim, patient professionalism. These were the men history almost never mentions, the ones whose entire war was fought among the dead. They had no illusions about glory. Their best day was one that sent a stranger's remains back to a family with the right name attached. Their nightmare was to send back the wrong one, or no name at all. And they set to work consolidating the scattered burials into one central cemetery. But when they began to dig, the ground did not match the maps. Graves that the records said were full turned out to be empty. Graves no one had marked gave up remains. The careful diagrams from 1943 pointed to the wrong places. The men doing the recovery found themselves working almost blind, guessing, cross-referencing, opening the earth and finding either nothing or someone they could not name. Over several months they recovered somewhere over 500 sets of remains. But of the roughly 1,500 men who had died on and around Tarawa, that left a terrible arithmetic. When the identification work was finished, only a little over 400 of the Betio dead had been given their names back. Hundreds more were buried again as unknowns, in a national cemetery in Hawaii, beneath white marble that said simply that here rested a comrade in arms, known but to God. And hundreds more than that were never found at all. The official word, in the cold language of the files, was that they were determined to be non-recoverable. Non-recoverable. It is a strange, heavy word. It does not mean gone. It means we know they are there, and we have decided we cannot reach them. It means the search is closed. For the families, that word arrived in a letter, and the letter was the end of the road. There would be no grave to visit, no remains to bury in the family plot. Only a name, carved eventually into a long wall in Honolulu, the Wall of the Missing, where the wind comes off the Pacific, and the list of names goes on and on and on. And that, for a very long time, was where the story stopped. A boy went to war. A boy died on a beach the size of a farm. And his country, having sent him, could not bring him back, and in time stopped trying. And the island grew a town over the top of him, and the people who loved him grew old, and died still not knowing exactly where he lay. It should have ended there. It did not, because some stories refused to stay buried, and some people refused to let them. Decades later, long after the last of the wartime recovery men had gone home and grown old, a different kind of searcher began to arrive on Betio. Not soldiers this time. A non-profit organization, founded by a private citizen, built around a single stubborn idea. That non-recoverable did not have to be forever. That with enough research, enough patience, enough respect, the men left in the sand could still be found. They began the way historians begin, in the paper. They gathered the old burial records, the casualty cards, the aerial photographs from 1943, the diagrams that had failed the recovery teams in 1946. They talked to the people of Kiribati who lived on the island now, who sometimes knew, from a lifetime of walking the same ground, where the earth held something it should not. They overlaid the old maps on the modern town, and slowly, painstakingly, They began to reconstruct where the lost cemeteries had actually been, as opposed to where the paperwork claimed. And then they dug. In the spring of 2015, on the north side of the island, a team located a long trench that had been missing for 70 years. In the records, it had a plain name, Cemetery 27. It had been reported to hold around 40 men, and then it had vanished from the surface of the earth so completely that for 7 decades no one could say where it was. Now, carefully, with brushes and screens and the slow discipline of archaeology, the team began to lift them out. Not bones to be catalogued. Sons, brothers, men with faces, once. They recovered more than 3 dozen from that single trench. And among the very first to be lifted from the sand was a man whose story tells you everything about who these people were. His name was Alexander Bonnyman. Everyone called him Sandy. He had been born in 1910 in Atlanta and raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, the son of a coal company president. He had gone to Princeton to study engineering and had dropped out. He had tried the Army Air Corps and washed out of flight training. He had gone west to New Mexico and built a life running a copper mining business. He was, by 1942, a married father in his early 30s, with a comfortable living and every reason to stay home. He enlisted anyway, as a private. By November of 1943, he was a first lieutenant, a combat engineer, on Betio. On the 3rd day of the battle, at a massive Japanese bunker that was holding up the entire American advance, Bonnyman led a small group up onto the top of the structure and held that ground against a furious counterattack, buying the time his fellow Marines needed. He was killed doing it. For those actions, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration his country could give. It was presented, a few years later, to his teenage daughter. And then, like so many others, he was buried on the island and lost. His grave marker joined the ones that came down. For 72 years, the nation's highest honor belonged to a man whose own family could not find him. His name was on the wall of the missing. A memorial stone stood for him in New Mexico, over no one, until a team, working from the old records, predicted almost exactly where he would be, and found him there. In September of 2015, Sandy Bonnyman came home to Knoxville. He was buried in the family plot 72 years after he fell, with Marines in dress uniform rendering the honors that had waited 3 generations to be paid. His grandson, who had spent years helping to search that island, was there to see it. He had gone looking for his grandfather in the sand of a Pacific atoll, and he had found him. Bonnyman was not the last. 4 years later, in 2019, the same partnership between that non-profit and the government's accounting agency located another lost burial row on Betio and lifted more than 30 additional men from the ground. One of them was a private first class named John Bayens, 20 years old, from Louisville, Kentucky. He had been killed on the 3rd day of the battle, the same day as Bonnyman, and reported buried in a cemetery whose location was later lost. In 2019, the science that his generation could never have imagined gave him his name back. A chest X-ray taken during the war matched to remains recovered from the sand. Think about how strange and gentle that is. During the war, military doctors X-rayed the chests of thousands of young recruits, screening for disease, never imagining that the faint shape of a collarbone or a rib on a piece of film might one day be the thing that carried a man home. The bone in the ground and the shadow on the old film are laid side by side, and they match, and a name that had been missing for 3/4 of a century is spoken again. It is a kind of homecoming performed with paperwork and patience. A young man, identified by the shape of his own bones, after 76 years. There was a sergeant from Chicago, Robert Van Heck, 25 years old, an amphibious tractor man, identified in recent years, and finally laid to rest in Illinois, more than 8 decades after Tarawa. There was a private first class named Louis Wiesahan, 20 years old, brought home after 77 years. One by one, name by name, the arithmetic of the non-recoverable is being quietly rewritten. As of the last few years, well over 100 of the Tarawa missing have been found and identified, and the searchers believe there may still be as many as several hundred more out there, under the island. Which means it is not over, even now. So let us go back to the beginning, to the strip of sand narrower than a runway, to the men beneath the road and the fuel drum, and the ordinary building where an ordinary day is happening overhead. What happened to the men buried in the sand of Tarawa? The honest answer is that we lost them, not in the battle. After it, we buried them in a hurry because we had to. And then we built over the top of them because we needed the runway, and we took down the markers and misplaced the maps. And we told their mothers they were at rest in graves that held no one. And then, when we came back and could not find them, we wrote a word in a file that closed the door. Non-recoverable. And we moved on, because there was a war to win, and then a world to rebuild, and then simply the long, ordinary business of forgetting. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the heart of this. These men were not lost because anyone was cruel. They were lost because of the tide, and the timing, and the terrible practicality of a nation at war, and then because of time itself, which erases the living memory of where a body lies as surely as any bulldozer. But here is the other truth, standing right beside the first one. A boy from Birmingham, who was 16. A sergeant from Dover, who was 45. A copper miner from New Mexico, who did not have to go, and went anyway. They are being found, slowly, stubbornly. One trench, one X-ray, one strand of evidence at a time, by people who decided that a word in a file was not the end of a man. There is a particular kind of courage in that, not the courage of the beach, though that was real and terrible, a quieter kind, the courage to keep looking for someone the whole world has agreed to stop looking for, to believe that a name is worth a decade of digging, to carry a stranger home. It is worth asking why it matters so much, this business of finding bones on an island most people could not place on a map. The men are dead either way. A grave in Knoxville does not undo a death at Tarawa. And yet everyone who has stood at one of these homecomings will tell you the same thing. It matters to the families, of course, the grandchildren and great-nieces who finally have a place to stand and grieve. But it seems to matter to something larger too. A promise was made, without words, the day these men were asked to go. We will not leave you behind. And a promise kept 80 years late is still a promise kept. Imagine being the one to lift him from the sand, to brush away 70 years and know, from a chart drawn in the middle of a battle, that this is him, that the mother who set his photograph on the mantle, and the wife who kept his letters, and the daughter who accepted his medal, were right to believe he was somewhere, and that the somewhere was here, all along, waiting. They are still waiting, some of them, under the island. Perhaps a few hundred, perhaps fewer, perhaps more. Men whose names are cut into a wall in Honolulu with a small marker beside those already found. A marker that means, at last, accounted for. The rest still wait for theirs. Somewhere on that island, under a house or a lane or the edge of the old airfield, a man is lying close to where his friends left him in November of 1943, in the same sand, while 3 generations of his family have lived and aged and wondered. He does not know that anyone is still coming, but someone is. That is why this story is told, and why it matters that you heard it. Not to reopen a wound, to keep a promise. The men in the sand of Tarawa were told they would come home. Most of them, in the end, will. But only for as long as someone remembers they are missing. Only for as long as the names are spoken, and the ground is searched, and a word in a file is treated as a question, and not a verdict. A man is not truly gone while someone is still looking for him. So we look, and we say the names, and we do not let the sand have the last word. If you believe these men should be remembered, and brought home, Stay with this channel and follow along, so that the next name, and the one after that, is not forgotten again.